On April 14, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln was shot in the head. The man behind this assassination, John Wilkes Booth, fled through Maryland and into Virginia, where he was discovered 12 days later at Garrett's farm. Booth had been tracked by a group of cavalrymen to the barn where he was hiding out with one of his accomplices, David Harold. The two detectives leading the investigation, Everton Conger and Luther Byron Baker, along with the cavalry's commander, Lieutenant Edward P. Doherty, ordered the barn surrounded. A sergeant approached the detectives and offered to go in alone and take the pair of criminals captive, but this offer was declined, and they settled instead to attempt to flush them out with fire. Harold agreed to surrender and was pulled from the barn. Booth, on the other hand, who had broken his leg at some point during his flight, and who was armed with a carbine rifle and at least one pistol as well as a Bowie knife, stubbornly refused to surrender. Knowing he had little chance of escape and would most likely die here, he alternately taunted the cavalry and asked to be allowed to fight for his freedom. Understanding that negotiating a surrender was no longer feasible, Conger, who stood behind the barn, started the fire while Baker and Doherty waited out front by the barn doors. The fire began to grow, and on the other side of the barn doors, Booth briefly looked for a way to stop it before fixing his rifle toward an opening in the barn door. It was at this point that Boston Corbett, the sergeant who had just offered to enter the barn alone, raised his revolver to a hole in the barn's wall and fired at Booth. The shot entered at the base of the left side of the skull and severed his spinal cord, causing immediate paralysis and killing him within 3 hours. Boston Corbett was famous. Born Thomas Corbett in 1832, he immigrated from England to the United States at 8 years old with his father, Bartholomew Corbett, his sister Emma, and his brother John. Their mother, Elizabeth, did not immigrate with them. It is unclear why, but it is possible her death led to the family's new start in America. Arriving in New York aboard the Zenobia, the Corbetts took up residence in a Manhattan neighborhood just a few blocks from the Five Points slum. At the time, the Five Points was a notoriously overpopulated and disease-ridden area known as a hotbed for crime and gang-related violence. Having been built over a pond filled in with mostly garbage and dirt, the neighborhood's buildings had a tendency to rot, sink, and even collapse on the soft foundation. This meant housing was, in addition to rancid and dangerous, cheap, and this was often the only option for the massive immigrant influx of the time, especially many Irish refugees fleeing the potato famine. By the 1840s, Manhattan's population had increased by 60%. Wages were low and unemployment was high. Bartholomew studied in naturalist science, an emerging field at the time which led to the works of figures like Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, although, based on the fact that Bartholomew is not mentioned in the literature of the time, it is more likely he made his living preparing taxidermy displays. Possibly unsatisfied with life and career in America, Bartholomew later returned to England at some point in the 1850s, while in his 70s. An 1865 newspaper report of a welfare check indicates that he was found by police to be living in squalor with a large collection of books and stuffed birds, and showing signs of both physical and mental deterioration. As a teenager, Thomas Corbett entered the hat-making trade, a profession which would later gain infamy for its use of mercury nitrate, a chemical which can cause severe damage to the brain, including cognitive decline, memory loss, tremors, mood changes, and severe neurological disorders, as well as hindered brain development in children. This, of course, is the origin of the phrase, mad as a hatter. Corbett spent most of his younger life as a hatter, and at some point in the early 1850s, he married a woman named Susan Rebecca, whose last name does not appear in records. The couple spent a number of years migrating around the East Coast as Corbett found work in places like New England, New Jersey, Philadelphia, and of course, New York. These being some of the cities with the largest hat-making industries at the time. In 1855, while working in Troy, New York, Corbett officially took an oath to become an American citizen. Following this, Thomas and his wife traveled south to Richmond, Virginia, a city which appears to have been difficult for him given his fierce opposition to slavery. A year later, things began to unravel for Corbett. While making a return voyage to New York, Susan fell seriously ill and died at sea on August 18th. Susan's death had a brutal effect on Thomas. He began drinking, both heavily and constantly, by all accounts. During the midst of a particularly drunken outing, he was taken in by a group of evangelical temperance Christians, an ideological branch of Christianity which advocates alcohol abstinence as a crucial virtue. While sobering up, Corbett reportedly underwent a religious awakening, marking the beginning of a lifetime of uniquely intense religious fervor. Although distinct in his commitment, Corbett was not alone in his awakening. America at the time was full of a variety of different kinds of newfound religious intensities brought on by the Second Great Awakening and the Businessmen's Revival, which, amidst the desperate living situations of the American working class during and following the Industrial Revolution, was bound to take root in people looking for some type of salvation. By 1858, a newly converted Corbett traveled to Boston for work, where he became a member of the Methodist Episcopal Church. His devotion continued to intensify. He began preaching in the streets, calling out to sinners that they should bear in mind the teachings of God and to avoid the temptation of alcohol and other such sinful seductions. These other seductions were what truly plagued Corbett at this time. Although he began to maintain his chastity in the wake of Susan's death, he was plagued by his sexual desires. Studying the Bible in search of some answer, Corbett fell onto Matthew 19:12, which states, "For there are some eunuchs which were so born from their mother's womb, and there are some eunuchs which were made eunuchs of men. And there be eunuchs which have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He that is able to receive it, let him receive it." On July 16th of that year, Corbett used a pair of scissors to castrate himself. According to a friend's account, Corbett had been instructed by God to do so. Following the castration, Corbett attended a prayer meeting and ate a full dinner before seeking medical attention. In less than a month, Corbett was discharged from the hospital, and according to sources, quite happy with his decision. 2 weeks later, on August 29th, Corbett was officially baptized by the Methodist Episcopal Church, and in honor of his conversion, changed his name to Boston, the city where it began. Corbett continued to develop further eccentricities, modeling his hair after representations of Christ and speaking in strange affectations when reciting Bible verses. Soon, the newly Boston Corbett returned to New York, taking up more hat-making work and dedicating himself further to religious life. In this pursuit, Corbett joined in ministry work with a man by the name of Orville Gardner, who lacked utterly any of Corbett's decent, if at times eccentric, interpersonal behavior. Gardner, nicknamed Awful Gardner, had previously made a name for himself in bare-knuckle boxing and, in one particular match against Alan McPhee, had won after 33 rounds over the course of an hour and 19 minutes. He had also faced numerous imprisonments for crimes both violent and non-violent, including an incident where he assaulted a woman, tried to fight her husband, and after being chased by a mob who tried to stop him from fleeing, turned and shot a man in the face. 2 years following, he was arrested again for biting part of another fighter's ear off. 2 years after this, He faced 6 months in prison for breaking a man's jaw after the man refused to visit a bar he suggested. A year later, in Jersey City, he was arrested again after a string of violence and destruction of property. Eventually, Gardner found God and began preaching. Corbett continued increasingly to work in devotion to God. In his spare time, he would collect drunkards from the street to help them, feeding and clothing the poor until he had no money or food left, even at times helping them to find work. At his own work, he would fall to his knees in prayer at the utterance of a curse or wrongdoing. As time went on, so did his exposure to Methodist teachings, and so did his faith grow stronger and stronger. Boston Corbett was becoming a truly devoted man of God. In December of 1860, South Carolina seceded from the Union. By 1861, the American Civil War had fallen on the nation. James H. Brown, Corbett's boss and a member of the 12th Regiment, was in poor health and asked Corbett to serve as his substitute. Corbett agreed and joined the 12th on April 19th. They were sent to Washington to defend the capital. On their arrival, President Lincoln greeted and gave his thanks to these new volunteers, shaking hands with every soldier, including the man who would later avenge his untimely death. Regimented drilling finally began here at Camp Anderson, and the scraggly group of volunteers finally began to resemble a real military outfit. By May 29th, they, along with a number of other regiments, were sent out to occupy various parts of Virginia. After an incident of theft in town by some of the soldiers, Colonel Butterfield, leader of the 12th and widely disliked by his men, assembled the entire regiment and accosted them for these accusations of theft, yelling, "I will have no damned thieves in this regiment." On hearing this language, Corbett stepped forward and condemned the colonel for his use of language. Corbett was promptly arrested and imprisoned in camp, where he proceeded immediately to go on a hunger strike and loudly sing hymns for 2 days straight before being released without further charges. The 12th was eventually sent to Western Virginia, where they were involved in the First Battle of Bull Run, a battle which would prove a hard loss for Union forces and would earn Confederate Colonel Stonewall Jackson his nickname. In April, the original 12th Regiment was sent home, but Corbett soon rejoined the Union as a corporal. On a particular Sunday in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, Corbett approached 2 soldiers from a different regiment who intended on picking blackberries that afternoon. Corbett was in possession of his Bible and his rifle. Upon learning their intentions for the day, Corbett reprimanded them and told them they should be keeping Sabbath. When they disregarded his words, he pulled his rifle on them and warned them against proceeding with their plan. This was not apparently an isolated incident. According to fellow New York soldiers, Corbett was quite trigger-happy, and it mattered not who the victim might be, so long as he should have any justification of authority for firing. While his Christian fanaticism seemed to inspire fervent abstinence from alcohol, sexuality, non-traditional behaviors, and even foul language, Corbett did not seem to shy away from violence in any way. On September 12th, rebels laid siege to Harper's Ferry, and within 3 days, the remaining 12,000 men were forced to surrender. This was the largest group of prisoners taken during the entirety of the Civil War. In a lucky turn of events, however, rather than being sent to camps, the Union soldiers simply had their weapons confiscated and were sent home. Corbett returned to New York, not returning to service for almost a year. During this interval, reports indicate Corbett appeared at church meetings, espousing his feelings of intense revelry at the violence he had been committing in the war. This naturally disturbed many other churchgoers, some describing violence as unchristian. Although attempts were made to expel him from the church, nothing ever came of this. Returning to the 12th in June of 1863, Corbett was sent to Pennsylvania to defend against encroaching rebel forces. When the Battle of Gettysburg broke out, Corbett and the 12th were posted north of the conflict and did not see action, But soon after this, New York soldiers were sent home in an effort to quell the race riots which had broken out. Originally, these riots began over the draft, but as Irish immigrants began blaming blacks for the war, a string of anti-black violence broke out that devolved into days of chaos. By the time soldiers arrived, the riots had died off and these soldiers were sent home. Once more, Corbett re-enlisted, this time with the 16th Cavalry. In June of 1864, Corbett was among the cavalrymen in pursuit of Mosby's Rangers, a group of guerrilla-style rebel forces who had been a sort of rival for the 16th going back months. Finding no sign of Mosby and needing rest, the group took refuge at a plantation outside of Centerville. The soldiers spread out carelessly across the grounds, some picking cherries in the trees, some occupying the house, and some meandering through the wheat fields which bordered the woods. Boston was among those in the fields. One of Mosby's scouts quickly discovered the group and realized something quite notable. There was only one man keeping watch. What's more, he was, apparently, asleep. In no time, a group of rebel forces had descended on the plantation, and the hapless Union soldiers scattered in all directions. The watchman was killed in passing from horseback. Almost none of the men had time to reach their weapons. Some were killed, most were captured, only a few escaped. But one man, having managed to flee with his rifle to a vantage point within a ditch, determined to make a stand, and that man was, of course, Boston Corbett. Not a single one of his shots had an impact on the incoming enemies, but the frequency of fire made approach impossible for the rebels. This news was reported back to the rebels' captain by a man named Bush Underwood. Underwood was instructed to return and make another attempt at capturing the lone gunman. Once again, he was unsuccessful and required the help of an additional 8 men before he could get close enough to disarm Corbett. When he did, Underwood was by this point furious. Dismounting from a still-moving horse, Underwood knocked the rifle from Corbett and put his revolver to the man's head. It is unclear who, but someone instructed Underwood against this. "34 men of the 16th Cavalry were taken as prisoners of war. A group of 14 of these men, including Corbett, were sent to a camp in Richmond. Soon they were sent farther south to a place by the name of Camp Sumter, also known as Andersonville Prison, although the term prison may be a misnomer. Andersonville was more like an outdoor pen with an ever-growing overflow of new prisoners. The camp had originally been built to house the surplus POWs from a camp in Belle Isle, a place where prisoners who froze to death were fed to hogs. At this point in the war, the exchange of prisoners had stopped, and this meant there was no other place to put these waves of men coming in by the thousands. At its peak, Andersonville housed 33,000 prisoners in a facility originally meant for 10,000. Worse still, money in the South was running out, and this meant prisoners were the last to be fed, last to be clothed, and last to receive medical treatment. Disease, overcrowding, starvation, and rampant death. These were the conditions Corbett and the other men of the 16th Cavalry entered into at Andersonville. Running along in front of the camp's fences was what they called the dead line, marked off with posts and a rail. If a prisoner stepped over it, he was shot. Accidentally, only an arm, only a leg, only for a moment, still they were shot. New prisoners who were unaware of this rule often fell victim to it, as did those who weren't paying attention. At times, men went over the line intentionally. Amongst the prisoners, a group of murderers and thieves emerged by the name of the Andersonville Raiders. When they were found out, they were hanged. Their bodies hung as beacons of law and order. Corbett's arrival was the day following. Like many others, he quickly fell ill, and his time in the camp became a struggle for survival. Conditions did not make illness any easier. The earth of the camp was swimming with maggots. The only stream running through the place was putrid and contaminated, and bodies were stacked by the hundreds along the fences. Corbett did not falter in his faith, even at a time like this. Along with a group of other men, he began giving sermons to the men of Andersonville, many of whom were sick, dying, and afraid. As was always the case with Corbett, this was met with a mixed reception. Some men thought he was aligned with the grace of God. Others thought him simply deranged. He kept an odd sort of hope, seemingly almost naive on the surface. He believed he would not, could not die here, because he was protected by the Lord. To other prisoners, this was simple lunacy, and only in retrospect can we see that, whether by luck or providence, somehow he was right. There were numerous counts of attempted escapes at Andersonville, and Corbett was one of these. In October 1864, Corbett fled into the woods while on a trip outside the stockade to collect firewood. Due to the extent of his malnutrition, he was able to hide himself in a small nook in the ground. Unfortunately, he was soon found out by dogs and sent back to camp without incident. He would spend the latter part of October being treated in the infirmary. Luckily, Corbett and the other men of Andersonville would soon be released anyway. By this time, the South was losing badly and almost entirely out of money and resources. Victory seemed in the cards for the North, and under these conditions, the Confederates agreed to a prisoner exchange. Corbett was one of these prisoners, planned to be sent home by boat. But scurvy, dysentery, and malnutrition had ravaged Corbett. One of the tendons in his leg had atrophied from the effects of the scurvy, and he was forced to make his way home on crutches and with constant medical assistance. Corbett would never fully recover his health. According to some, he seemed oddly unaffected by this entire experience. By January of 1865, he had re-enlisted in the New York 16th Cavalry, also becoming involved in the U.S. Christian Commission at the same time. Meanwhile, a man by the name of John Wilkes Booth, a stage actor and Southern loyalist, had been plotting against President Lincoln for months. His initial plan to kidnap the president and hold him ransom as a means of prisoner exchange had fallen through, and by this time, bargaining on behalf of the Confederacy was useless. Northern victory was a sure thing. But Booth saw Lincoln as a tyrant, and so regardless of the war's outcome, Lincoln's disempowerment was the necessary course of justice. Booth's hatred could not be quelled. Instead, his plan turned from kidnapping to murder. Using the network of co-conspirators he had accrued during the planning of the kidnapping, he now laid out a plan to assassinate President Lincoln, Vice President Andrew Johnson, and Secretary of State William Seward, all in the same night. On the night of April 14th, things went mostly according to plan for Booth. The president arrived at Ford's Theater for that night's performance of Our American Cousin, accompanied by First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln, as well as Colonel Henry Rathbone and his fiancée. Making his way into Ford's Theater, a place he had made himself familiar with as an actor, Booth ascended to the presidential box, where he had previously drilled a peephole into the door. Making sure his timing was right, he entered the box at the exact moment of a comedic uproar in the performance, hoping the laughter would aid in muffling the noise of the gunshot. Armed with a single-shot .44 caliber Philadelphia Derringer pistol and a knife, Booth approached and fired at the president. The bullet entered the left side of Lincoln's head and lodged in the brain. The wound would prove deadly within 9 hours. Leaping forward in an attempt to disarm Booth, Rathbone was slashed in the arm, which severed an artery and sent blood spewing over the vicinity. With Rathbone immobilized, Booth leapt from the balcony of the presidential box, catching his boot spur on one of the flags which decorated it. He landed awkwardly on the stage below, and without stopping, made his way to center stage, where he reportedly declared, "Sic Semper Tyrannis," thus always to tyrants. Heading to an exit, he fled on horseback. Unfortunately for Booth, his target would be the only one that went according to plan. Lewis Powell, the man tasked with assassinating Seward, would only be able to inflict Seward with non-fatal stab wounds before being fought off by two of Seward's sons and a nurse, and being forced to flee into the night. George Atzerodt, a notorious drunk, would lose his nerve at the last moment and did not carry out his attack on Johnson. Nearly all of Booth's co-conspirators were apprehended within a few days, and only David Harold, who had been with Powell and had fled when he heard the screams of the failed attack, joined up with Booth in the aftermath of that night. The pair stopped at the home of Dr. Mudd, who splinted Booth's broken leg and had a set of crutches put together for him, before sending the two on their way. Over the course of the next few days, Booth and Harold bounced around through a network of Confederate sympathizers, variously laying low and traveling by stealth, negotiating through both coercion and threat. As days went on, the reward for Booth and Harold grew, eventually reaching $100,000, roughly $2 million in today's money. With the help of 3 Confederate soldiers, Private Willie Jett, Lieutenant Mortimer Ruggles, and Private Absalom Bainbridge, the 2 conspirators were escorted to Garrett's farm, where they would be discovered a few days later after Jett, under questioning by Detective Conger, would reveal their location. When the cavalry arrived, the Garrett family eventually directed them to the barn, where Harold's capture and Booth's death would unfold. The body would be wrapped in a horse blanket for transportation. After a convoluted return to Washington, D.C., during which the party was split up, and Jett was at some point able to escape, the trial of the remaining conspirators began on May 10th. In addition to David Harold, the accused included Lewis Powell, George Atzerodt, Mary Surratt, Dr. Samuel Mudd, Samuel Arnold, Edmund Spangler, and Michael O'Loughlin. Harold was described as a doltish, insignificant-looking young man, while Surratt, the owner of the boarding house where the conspirators had met, was said to be a belle in her youth. Powell was reported to be very tall with an athletic, gladiatorial frame, the tight-knit shirt which was his only upper garment disclosing the massive robustness of animal manhood, but also appeared to have neither intellect nor intelligence in his unflinching dark gray eyes. Atzerodt was apparently a short, thick-set, round-shouldered, brawny-armed man with a stupid expression and a vulgar-looking creature, but not apparently ferocious. He is just the sort of man to promise to commit a murder and then fail on coming to the point. During the trial, the suspected conspirators were kept heavily restrained and, with the exception of Surratt, with bags over their heads. Powell's bag had to be lined with padding after he began slamming his head into the wall. Corbett was brought in to testify on May 17th. He described the events of April 26th, starting from the surrounding of the farm through to the point of pulling the trigger on Booth. On June 30th, the military commission delivered its verdict. Harold, Powell, Atzerodt, and Surratt were all sentenced to death. On July 7th, they were hanged. In the midst of all this, Corbett had become nationally known for his part in Booth's killing. To some, he was a hero, questioned by newspapers, citizens, and friends alike, autographs and pictures as well. To others, particularly the remaining underbelly of the Confederate South, he was a detested villain. He began receiving threats by mail which promised to avenge Booth's death, and never traveled without a gun. To still others, he was simply a lunatic, the glory to God man who had gone rogue. Although this last claim was not entirely valid, since he had not directly violated any order. Just days after giving his testimony, Corbett became involved in an incident for which he would be court-martialed. Dispatched with the 16th Cavalry to Bladensburg, Maryland, Corbett's health was still feeble, and finding a warm, dry place to sleep was important. The horse barn, to which the 16th was assigned, was split usage, the other half being assigned to a different group of cavalry. Being unable to find a spot on the 16th Cavalry's side of the barn, Corbett moved to the other side of the barn, where he began to rest. Spotting him, the quartermaster questioned Corbett, and instructed him not to stay on this side of the barn. Returning later to find him in the same spot, the quartermaster woke him up and grabbed him by the shoulder, instructing him once again to leave. Pausing for a moment, Corbett drew his revolver and set it at the quartermaster's chest, instructing him to remove the hand from Corbett's shoulder. The quartermaster fled, and Corbett left the barn. The incident was reported, but Corbett's court-martial summoning was delayed when Corbett fell ill. He eventually received a very light sentence, a reprimand from a superior officer. This was likely due both to Corbett's fame and the genuine fragility of his health for which he had been trying to accommodate. In Washington, D.C., the Grand Review of the Armies began on May 23rd. This was a 2-day military parade and celebration, and Corbett's 16th New York Cavalry was in attendance. The city overflowed, thousands and thousands filling the pubs, sleeping on the streets, watching the proud survivors from the doorways, the windows, and the rooftops. After a horror unlike anything the country had ever seen, the war was over. The victors rejoiced. Many would have seen this as a miracle. To Corbett, this may well have been simply inevitable. The will of God restored. 2 days later, Corbett was hospitalized. Under care at the barracks, Corbett met a man by the name of George Huron, who had also served. Huron would soon attain a law degree and travel to Valley Falls, Kansas, with the intention of starting a practice. The pair would remain out of contact for a long period of time. As Corbett's health grew worse, he was transferred along to 2 different military hospitals which, because the war was at its close, were both eventually shut down, before being able to settle at the Douglas Hospital. By August 17th, he was officially released from military service because of his health. Corbett was eventually advised by doctors to return to New York, advising that Washington's summer climate may put undue stress on his health. Before leaving, he testified at the trial of Henry Wirz, the Confederate captain who had served as commandant of Andersonville prison. Corbett's testimony was heard on August 28th, and by October, Wirz was convicted. He hung on November 10th. Corbett returned to Manhattan directly after his testimony and resumed his life as though the war had never happened, rejoining the workforce and attending prayer meetings. What did change was his celebrity status. He was often requested for public speaking engagements. He was also inundated with the attention of admirers, foes, and skeptics alike. For the rest of his life, he would continue to be plagued both by threats and those who questioned the truth of Booth's killing, which meant that for the rest of his life, he would be on the defensive, both for his safety and his honor. Over time, the applications for those who felt entitled to a share of the reward money for the apprehension of the conspirators would begin to pile up. Corbett, who initially claimed to have no interest in the reward, eventually reversed this stance and submitted an application. Lieutenant Doherty also submitted an application, and a conflict broke out between him and Detective Conger, both claiming to have been in charge of the manhunt. The truth appears not entirely clear, but the affidavits submitted by the men of the 16th Cavalry all lean in favor of Doherty, citing that while none of the men of the 16th slept for days, Conger had stopped for at least one nap. In the end, of course, the more politically connected Conger ended up with a greater share. In addition to the primarily involved parties, Anyone who had even a loose connection to the operation began submitting applications on the off chance that they may receive even some small share. Corbett, on his own behalf, enlisted the help of claims agents in an attempt to gain a more significant part of the reward, largely in vain. In the coming years, Corbett bounced around, struggling to make ends meet and finding work variously in New York, Philadelphia, Connecticut, New Jersey, and even briefly spending time in Cleveland. Following the war, the country struggled with a severe depression which had been brought on in part by an overinvestment in railroad expansion, leading to a butterfly effect of further and further economic collapse. This depression was rivaled only later by the Great Depression, and so, at the time, was the worst financial crisis the country had ever seen. Like many others, Corbett was able to get by only with increasing difficulty. Eventually, Corbett settled in Camden, New Jersey, and eventually began using his own home to lead regular prayer meetings and serving as the small group's leader. Serving as a guest speaker at a soldiers' reunion event in 1875, which hosted both Union and Confederate soldiers, Corbett became involved in an argument with a group of men who speculated that Booth may not have been killed at all. One of the men made a move toward him, and Corbett, always ready with his revolver, drew on his face. Only with great difficulty was the situation diffused. According to R.B. Hoover, the man who had been assigned a room with Corbett at the event, Corbett spent the remainder of the night espousing what seems to have been growing paranoia about the powers in Washington conspiring against him, before pacing the room and intermittently beseeching God. Corbett would eventually fall asleep, keeping his revolver under his pillow. As the months went by, Corbett faced increasing poverty and desperation. In 1878, in an act of desperation, Corbett wrote to President Rutherford B. Hayes, hoping his well-known involvement in the Booth manhunt may secure a job. Hayes did not respond. Corbett then began reaching out to his network of friends, hoping possibly to secure opportunity in a new part of the country. Corbett heard back from a number of people, and somehow, it is unclear from whom, discovered an 80-acre plot of land which remained unclaimed in Concordia, Kansas. He made a trip there that summer, probably to scout his prospects, and in September of 1878, with no other options, Corbett set his sights on permanent relocation to Kansas. What Corbett would later discover was that the reason this land had not been claimed was because it was virtually unfarmable. With no money and no other options to travel, Corbett decided to walk to Kansas. By the time he reached Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, he had given up on this idea. Somehow securing a train ticket to Pittsburgh, he reached out to a local newspaper, hoping he may be able to leverage his celebrity status and his desperate situation into some type of assistance from the public. Luckily for him, the Commercial Gazette needed the story. The story served its intended purpose, and by the next day, Corbett had secured a train pass and continued on his way to Kansas. On his arrival, Corbett was forced to acknowledge some difficult facts. Aside from the fact that he didn't know how to farm, the rocky terrain was not suited to growing crops. In addition to this, his health had devolved to the point that he was virtually unable to do his own farming. His crops quickly failed, and he settled instead on raising sheep. Hiring some men to help carve out the side of a hill, Corbett was able to construct a one-room dugout home made up of sod and limestone with a wooden floor inside. He quickly made himself at home in Concordia and developed a circle of friends, mostly fellow faithfuls. Not all the other churchgoers took a liking to him, however, and many complained of his overly emphatic depictions of a fire and brimstone afterlife filled with sinners thrown into oblivion by an unforgiving God. Attempts were made to bar him from the church, but these were unsuccessful. As time went on, he continued to struggle. Even with the help of neighbors, Corbett's desperation continued, and he eventually sought out a military pension. Somehow, despite his renown, the system of bureaucracy he dealt with made it very difficult for him, requiring both further proof of service and proof of disability. Even after this, he was initially rejected, and it was only nearly 2 years after he began the process, with the help of Senator Preston B. Plum, that he was able to finally win over a monthly pension. It was $6 a month. This would be less than $200 today, but luckily it was enough to keep him afloat. In the public eye, the validity of the Booth story continued to be scrutinized, and Corbett's integrity was perpetually challenged. Despite the vocal support of some who spoke out on his behalf, many continued to speak ill of him, painting him as no more than a morally repugnant madman. Regardless of their truth, these portrayals must have weighed on his mind, at least to some extent. For the most part, life went well for Corbett in Concordia, and scandal was limited to difficult personal interactions caused by his increasingly unpredictable and irritable disposition. His mostly secluded living situation probably helped with this. He allowed no one in his home, even when he had visitors. But in November of 1885, an incident arose in which Corbett, armed with his rifle, fired on a group of children who had come onto the property, sons and nephews of his neighbors, the Whiteheads. It is unclear what started the problem. One source claims they had been playing baseball on the Sabbath, but it's most likely he intended only to fire a warning shot. None were hurt, but naturally, a criminal complaint was filed, and Corbett was summoned to court. What happened in court remains unclear, but what is known is that either someone seemed to accuse someone of being a liar, or the case was going poorly for Corbett, and at this point, Corbett drew his revolver on the crowded courtroom. Amidst the panic, Corbett backed out of the courtroom and fled on horseback, returning home. The next day, Constable John Linton and a doctor by the name of Dabney paid Corbett a visit with the intention of arresting him. Corbett met them at the door with his rifle and made it clear he had no intention of going with them. Corbett was left alone and the case was dropped, but word of the incident eventually spread to the news, and a biting condemnation of character based on a source from his prayer group was published. Half the people want him arrested, the other half left alone. We have known Corbett for more than 20 years. All churches have members of the crank type. Corbett was one of the sort who think that everything which comes into their heads is inspired by God. They will interrupt meetings, burst out unexpectedly in yells, make interlocutory remarks while another is leading in prayer, and go generally as if they were performers in a circus, instead of being contented with taking their turn and with an occasional old-fashioned Methodist shout, marked by reverence, pathos, and unction, and which does good, not harm. Corbett used to speak in Fulton Street prayer meeting, till he was frozen out, and all who knew him rejoiced when he went west. A year later, Corbett began experiencing both financial and homestead proprietary troubles. He had quickly run out of pension money, and recent legal changes began making it difficult for Corbett to file a proper claim of ownership on his land. News of this spread to the papers, and an old friend from Union service, George W. Knapp, now a member of the Kansas House of Representatives, offered Corbett a job in Topeka. Corbett would receive $3 a day as a doorman, money Corbett couldn't refuse, so he left his horse and livestock in the possession of friends and headed to Topeka. But this decision would come to prove detrimental to Corbett, and would ultimately cost him what little he had left in this world, even his freedom. Soon, Corbett would begin to spiral. By this point, Corbett's paranoia had already begun to progress, but it reached a head while he started work at the Kansas state capitol. Corbett became convinced that other workers in the building were mocking him behind his back, calling him womanly for his hairstyle, and he began taking offense at comments most likely not intended as insult. He also began questioning the friendship of Knapp, accusing him of prioritizing his Masonic associations over loyalty to Corbett. On February 15th, a group of men sweeping the halls, including janitor and friend of Corbett, Ben Williams, were laughing among themselves. Corbett overheard a comment which he apparently interpreted as a slight and approached the group, drawing his pistol. The other men fled before Williams could even turn around to see Corbett. Gun drawn, Corbett approached, and Williams claimed he had been laughing at another man. Williams, too, fled. As if nothing had happened, Corbett picked up a broom and carried on with the sweeping. Word of the incident spread quickly through the State House, and Corbett was soon approached by Sergeant-at-Arms Charlie Norton. Norton questioned Corbett about the incident, and Corbett, in his customary fashion, pulled his gun out once again and made threats to shoot. Norton quickly fled the scene and summoned the police. Corbett then began making his way throughout the building, first to the Capitol's West Gallery, where he appeared to stand guard for a period of time, then to the Ladies' Gallery, where he seated himself. Attempting to get a story out of the incident, a newspaper reporter approached him tentatively and began asking questions. Corbett rose from his seat, drew his gun, and left the area. Knapp and another man who knew Corbett endeavored to reason with him, but this was unsuccessful, and Corbett only accused them of conspiracy. Drawing his gun once again, he instructed the pair to leave him alone. They obliged. Hours later, police were finally able to convince Corbett to put away his gun, at which point he was apprehended and taken to the city jail. The next day he stood trial, and attempted to justify his actions by his conviction that he had been mocked for his haircut, arguing that for this, Williams deserved violence. Taking the stand, he also laid out his belief that there was a mysterious plot at hand attempting to somehow work against him. He made claims of being followed, his cattle being murdered, and his pasture being set fire to. He also noted that John Wilkes Booth had been involved in a secret society, of which Corbett was apparently deeply suspicious. Corbett was declared insane and sent to the Kansas State Insane Asylum. Management of Corbett's assets was handed over to George Huron, the lawyer whom Corbett had met years earlier while hospitalized in D.C. Corbett informed the doctors there was something wrong with his head, and consistently claimed his incarceration to be the result of a conspiracy. Noting his years-long history of quick excitement to violence, Corbett was assigned an overseer by the doctors. Although Corbett's outbreaks in the asylum were largely verbal, accusing virtually everyone involved in his life of conspiracy, on one account he was briefly left alone by his overseer, which he quickly used as an attempt to make an assault with a knife on a dining hall attendant. He was disarmed, and nothing came of the incident. Over time, Corbett's physical health improved, yet his mental state remained the same. Corbett remained convinced that even the slightest misfortune was evidence of a conspiracy, and according to a doctor, he seems to continuously long for blood. When the news of Corbett's commitment to the asylum was made public, an old friend from Andersonville, Richard Thatcher, refused to believe the idea that Corbett had gone, or always was, insane. At this time, Thatcher was living 120 miles to the south in Neodesha and came to visit Corbett. After talking to him, Thatcher became fully convinced that Corbett was in fact the victim of a grand conspiracy. According to Corbett, the conspiracy was an act of vengeance for Corbett's interference in the government's ability to bring Booth to execution, and to thus properly mythologize the event of Lincoln's assassination. The death of Booth had been meant to be a spectacle. Thatcher did what he could to help free Corbett, but was ultimately unsuccessful. After 7 months in the asylum, Corbett was declared permanently insane and unlikely to ever see freedom again. But on the 26th of May, 1888, Corbett saw his chance. Out on the street with other patients on what was called a fitness parade, Corbett witnessed a young boy leave his pony unattended. Corbett made a break for it. Quickly untying the animal, he mounted and was in flight before anyone could stop him. Police were alerted, and a search was conducted across the city. Rumors spread of a possible vengeance-killing spree against government officials. Precautions were taken, but nothing came of this. There were no leads, and Corbett seemed to have simply vanished. In reality, he was on his way south to Neodesha, hoping to gain assistance from Thatcher. Making his way carefully over the course of a few days, likely riding by night, Corbett was welcomed by his friend on the 31st. Corbett received a small sum of money which he had entrusted to Thatcher, and he was then taken to a train depot, where he boarded and said he was headed for Mexico. Corbett was never heard from again. Over the next decade, Boston Corbett was searched for exhaustively. In one incident, a different man, a John Corbett, even attempted to pose as the real Corbett in a scheme to acquire his unaccounted-for pension and asset funds, and the man was brought up on charges of perjury and attempted fraud, but nothing legitimate ever surfaced. There were shaky leads, rumored sightings, one story that Corbett had been killed in an 1894 Minnesota wildfire, but as the years went by, Corbett's vanishing came to be permanent, and so Lincoln's Avenger was lost to history. Many things can be said about Corbett: a fierce Christian, a loyal soldier, a public menace, and a strange accident of history. He helped those he cared for and had little patience for those he did not. His faith called him to maim himself in order to remain chaste, and yet he had no issue doling out violence and constant threats against his fellow man. A few thought him gracious, but most seemed to think him insane. Most certainly a walking contradiction. And on the surface, Corbett's story may appear to be simply that of a captivating madman. And maybe it was. But in many ways, Corbett's story is not unique. In many ways, the life of Boston Corbett is one that is quintessentially American. A poor immigrant who comes in search of opportunity and finds a life of mostly baseline toil to survive. A man driven mad by suffering and still madder by the redemption of his faith. A man so twisted in the mind as to think lust a far greater sin than murder, and to think his vengeful God any real God at all. A loudly Christian man who, instead of loving his neighbor, shot at their children. A man who was either born mad or driven mad, whether by brain damage, war trauma, zealotry, or infamy. A man who was a hapless victim of the government he served. A man who was an instinctive nuisance and a constant threat. A horrible, noble, thoughtless, and self-righteous beast of a sometimes half-decent man. In summary, a perfectly American man.